There it is. There's the eagle.
Can't you see? I'm gonna crawl inside and die.
Look at that one. That's pretty good shape, huh? You can walk all around up there. It's only $2 a person.
It's kind of collapsed since it was first used, but
We get the idea.
and we're having a ranger talk starting right now. It's only one all day.
Those of you that are here for the program, I guess we should get started. It's about that time already. My name is Jose Castillo. I'm one of the rangers here at Tuzigoot, and I welcome all on behalf of National Park Service. Now, before I continue, I might mention a couple of things. One, of course, is that the walls of Tuzigoot are really old and fragile, so of course we ask that nobody climb them or walk on them or anything like that. Then also, it is cooling down this time of the year. It is nice and comfortable. However, believe it or not, the rattlesnakes are still out. We caught 3 of them in the last few days. We actually caught one yesterday. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll come out and they'll sun themselves right on the sidewalk. So if you do see one, give them plenty of space, come back and tell us about it. And what we do is we capture them and we relocate them. Or we get into a herpetologist, what she does, she puts transmitters in their bellies and then follows them around all summer. Some people have all the luck, I'm telling you. It's got to be a dream job. But anyways, rattlesnakes are strictly defensive creatures. They're not going to chase you. You're too big, they can't eat you. Usually what they do is they coil up and stand on the ground and go the opposite direction. So like I said, if you do see one, give them plenty of room. Come back and tell us about it and we'll take care of it. Now, I am going to be talking about the ancient cultures here in the bed of the valley. And you're going to see that while these different cultures were here, the climate was in constant flux. The landscape was changing, the geology was changing, the landscape was changing, the climate was changing, and people were adapting to these changes, and they were also adapting to the resources which were shifting and changing in their environment. And what you will see, and you'll see this come up again and again all through the program, is that the geology and the climate of any area will not only determine what resources will be available, but also determine how and where people will live. And we'll see this come up again and again. Now, archaeologists believe that the first people showed up here many thousands of years ago, some say as far back as 13,000. Now, around 13,000 years ago, that was pretty much the end of the Ice Age. The great ice sheets were receding back north. Now, the great glaciers and ice sheets did not come down this far, but the weather was affected down here. During that time period, around 13,000 years ago, we had more of a temperate climate. It was a lot cooler. You had conifers growing down in the lowlands. Definitely more cooler, more hospitable area. Different kinds of wildlife out here. But right around that time period is when it starts to get progressively drier, progressively hotter, eventually becoming a desert-like community as we see here all throughout the Southwest. And people, of course, the people that were here, were adapting to these changes, and they were adapting to the resources which were changing, the resources which were available. Now, archaeologists are pretty sure the first people that showed up here were nomadic hunting and gathering communities. They moved around a lot. they followed wild game around, and they collected wild foods. And while they were here, they learned to use practically every plant and animal for one purpose or another, either for food or tools or medicine or whatever needed to be comfortable. And we're pretty sure a lot of this knowledge learned through trial and error. You try something and if it works for you, you build on that knowledge. You build your own technology that way. Try something and it doesn't work, well, you're done. And kind of way it was in the olden days, wasn't any union laboratories or anything like that. A lot of people had to learn how to do a lot of different kinds of things. Now, as it turns out, here at Tuzigoot, we have many of the native plants that you find in the area. They're probably used by the early groups that are here. Now, follow me, I'll show you a few of these.
Is it ours to join you rather than have you
You're
repeat?
very welcome to join us.
We'll go buy our ticket later.
More the merrier. Just buy your tickets up. Okay. Now the first plant I'd like to point out would be this spiky thing right here. This is what we call a banana yucca. It is a common plant out here in the southwest and it has a wide variety of uses. Now if you look closely, see these fibers sticking out of the plant. Those fibers are coming off the leaves. Those fibers are actually very strong. You get a bunch of those fibers, you braid them together, it makes a very strong rope. It makes great basket weaving material. Have sharp needles here, makes a handy needle and thread for sewing. You can weave it into mats like for sitting on or for lying on. Weave it into a net you set for catching fish or birds, or make a snare, make traps to catch wild animals. Other uses not really apparent. By looking at this plant, you can take the roots of this plant and mush them up, makes a very fine lather. And there are many modern tribes today that still use it as a shampoo. During the summer, this plant will grow fruits about the size of cucumbers, and they are edible. So it also could have been used as a source of food. It's a very durable material. You could also weave it into things like sandals or footwear. And sometimes we still find those sandals today left behind by the Sinao or the Anasazi in the caves. So you see this one plant that has many, many uses. And you will see that there were many other plants out in the desert which were similarly used. Now, does anybody know what this is? Mesquite, very good. Is actually a velvet mesquite, a common tree or bush out here in the southwest, grows both as a bush and a tree. It grows as far south as Mexico and sure farther than that. As far west as California. Generally likes to grow low-lying areas where it's nice and hot.
Is it okay to touch one of those leaves?
You can touch it. Now, this tree is in the legume family. It's like a pea and will grow pods like peas. And those pods, when they're nice, new, and green, you can chop them up and boil them. The seeds get really soft. They taste kind of like lentils. They're really good. Or when the pods are dry, grind them up into a meal. Turn it into breads or biscuits. Very high in protein. So it's probably a very important food source for the early groups that were here. Then, of course, it also makes fine firewood. Okay, if you follow me, I'm going to point out a few more plants that we've been on our way.
Yeah. Yeah.
For a little while. Get everybody a chance to get here. Okay, there are two plants that I want to point out here. The first one would be the agave, and the next one would be the ocotillo. Now, the agave, if you look down, you'll see a whorl of, very thick, tough leaves, serrated. They have, spikes on the edges, and it has a stalk that sometimes comes out. Also known by various other names, also known as agave is the genus. Many different species of agave. Some grow as tall as a man could stand.
Is that A-G-A-V you're saying? What's that word?
A-G-A-V-E, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And also known as a mezcal, also known as maguey, also known as century plant. A lot of people know it as a century plant. Now the reason I want to point out this plant is because it was probably a very important plant for the early groups that were here. Almost every part of this plant can be used for one purpose or another. Now, starting from the top, the blossoms themselves are edible. You could eat the blossoms raw, or you can cook them if you'd like. And also the seeds of the plant, you can also grind those into flour, like for making breads or making a mush. Now you look at the stalk looks kind of woody, kind of tough, but when the stalk is just coming up, it's new and green, and you can chop it up into sections. You boil those sections. They're very nutritious and it is edible. And then the center of the plant, sometimes what people would do is they'll chop off the top and you cut out the center hearts of the plants. And what you do is you dig this big long ditch, you put in branches and burning material down in that ditch, and then there's sort of like some shells in there. You put these hearts of the plants in there, you cover it up with branches and leaves and other material, and what you do is you smoke it overnight. And what you get in the morning, you get a very sweet, juicy mass, which is very nutritious. And we know that the ancient cultures used to use this plant this way because we still find those roasting pits today. All over the southwest, as far south as Mexico, as far north as Utah, probably even farther north than that. And then the leaves of this plant are very tough, very fibrous. You could also take those leaves, use them the same way you use the yucca. The fibers would make a very strong rope. You could also use it for making a fabric, like for making clothing. Other possibilities, you could also weave it into like a mat and things like that. And then what my mom used to do is you would chop off the center stalk, and then you would dig out a chamber in this plant. And what you do is you put a big old rock on it to keep the coatimundis out of there. And what happens is this plant would try to heal itself by secreting a juice into that chamber. And what happens every morning, you take the big rock off and you get a cup of juice every morning. Very sweet, very nutritious. So,
And just drink it?
and just drink it, yes. Just drink it just like that. So it was probably a very important plant for the early cultures that were here. There are many modern cultures today that still use this plant in some of those fashions. Now the other one I want to point out would be this branches thing, the straight branches. It's got spines coming off of it. This is an ocotillo. During the summer, it's got leaves that grow all the way up and down the stems, and then it's got nice, red blossoms, which can also be made into jellies or jams and candy. So it also was edible. And then the branches of that plant, they could be used for building material, like for building fences and roofs and things like that. Now, does anybody have any questions before we move on? Okay, let's go to Tuzigoot.
See a rattlesnake when we know. Look at this one.
Okay, this will be our next stop for a little while. Okay, get everybody a chance to get here. Okay, I'm guessing everybody's here. Also be aware there might be people passing, so you might want to give them space every now and then when you come by. Now, I was talking about the early nomadic groups that were here that lived many thousands of years ago. Now, we don't here at Tuzigoot, I'm sure all over the Southwest, we don't have a lot of evidence, a lot of artifacts left behind by these ancient cultures, and mostly it's because they were nomadic, they moved around a lot, they lived lightly on the land, they made temporary shelters. They didn't really leave a lot for us to go on. But here at Tuzigoot, we may have one depression or one artifact left behind by these very ancient nomadic cultures. You look down here, you see this little depression right here. This is what we call a mortar, and it is used for grinding small seeds like grass seed or mesquite beans and things like that. And if you think about it, like maybe thousands of years ago, you would have women and children. You'd have these big, deep baskets, and you would be going through a grassy field, and you would be winnowing those seeds. You'd be collecting those seeds, and then you come back. And if you ever hike around, let's say Oak Creek Canyon or some of the canyons out in
over around Sedona, you'll find, sometimes you'll find huge slabs of rocks along the creek, and it will be just covered with these depressions. And if you can imagine, thousands of years ago, women and children will be sitting around and they'll be, like we would say, grinding your daily bread. And the women would be telling the stories of the culture and promoting the culture to the young. In the meantime, the men would be out, they'd be out hunting for game and things like that, looking for meat. And a lot of us don't think about it, but there's actually food all the way around us. If you look over here on this side, we have all this bushy stuff down here. This is all mesquite. That's all mesquite and acacia, as I talked about before. And then the dark green stuff over there, that's all cattails. We have Tavaski marsh over there. And of course, back in thousands of years ago, people would be hunting the waterfowl, geese, ducks, beaver, otter, things of that sort. Even in historical times, some of the settlers will talk about trapping something like 200 beaver a month. So it was definitely a lot of resources out here when the early cultures were here. Now, during the time when these cultures were here, the weather was changing, the climate was changing, the geology was changing, and people were adapting to those changes. And what happened is that there were periods where you had wet periods where you had a lot of rainfall, more rainfall than usual, and then you had dry periods where you had out and out droughts. And during these time periods, when you had the wet periods, the marshes would be more extensive and people would be taking advantage of those resources. Probably more beaver, more fish, more waterfowl, more cattails. Even the cattails are edible. And then during the dry periods, the marshes would diminish, and you would get a shift of plant dominance, and then you would have more desert scrub, more desert-like type of plants, more cactuses, and people would have to adapt. People would have to adapt to the resources which were then available. If you look behind you, just behind you, we have a little cactus here. People would probably be concentrating on things like the cactus. This is an Engelmann's prickly pear. It is a common cactus out here. If you ever go hiking around the foothills, you'll sometimes see that foothills are just covered with this type of cactus. Almost every part of this plant is edible. You could also eat almost every part of this plant. During the summer, it'll grow fruits, prickly pears, which can be peeled. They're very sweet, very juicy. They taste like miniature watermelons. And then the pads themselves, when they're new and green, you can skin them, you dice them, and you boil them. And they go good with beans and rice and meat and various other foods. Definitely very nutritious. So during the dry periods, people would have to adapt, and they would have to concentrate more on the cactuses. They'd have to concentrate more on the ocotillos, the agaves, things of that sort, more of the desert types of plants. Different kinds of wildlife. Of course, for meat, they would have to concentrate more on things like quail, more desert types of birds. Maybe the reptiles, some of the larger reptiles, and javelina, things of that sort. Now, does anybody have any questions before we move on?
What's a javelina?
Javelina is, you could say it's sort of a desert variety of a pig. It's not in the pig family, but it's similar to a pig.
Oh, thank you.
You're
What's
welcome.
going on out here?
I'm going to talk about that when we get over on that side, so if I forget, remind me. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to go up to Tuzigoot, we're going to turn right, we're going to talk a little bit about the tailings area, and then we're going to come back on the left side, and we're going to continue over on this side.
No, I just take a picture
Okay,
of
give
it.
everybody a chance to get here. What was that?
The javelina, there never used to be any 25 years ago around here. Now they're everywhere.
They're around, yeah.
Is it illegal to shoot them now or something?
You can still hunt them. They're huntable. You can hunt them. Okay, they're regulated just like any other game. Just like any other game around here. You gotta get permits and everything.
See what he says for
Okay, is that everybody? Okay, I'm guessing there's still more people coming.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
What does Tuzigoot mean?
Tuzigoot. Well, I would like to get everybody to get a chance to that, but okay, I might as well. You could say Tuzigoot is an English assimilation of an Apache phrase. During the time of excavation, archaeologists were looking for a name for the site back in 1933. One of the workers happened to be an Apache person named Ben Lewis, and he suggested something like Tuzigoot. And roughly translated, it's been roughly translated as crooked water, which refers to Peck's Lake, which is beyond this flat here. It kind of drops down. You can't see it from here before the first ridge. So that's where the word Tuzigoot comes from.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm guessing everybody's kind of here. Now the reason I stopped here is I want to talk a little bit about the copper tailings. Not very much about the copper tailings themselves, because that's all modern. But everybody keeps asking me about that, so I should say a little bit about that. What that is waste left behind by the mining industry. They mined the ore in the town of Jerome, hauled it to the smelters as at Clarkdale, the big beige buildings there. They crush the rock, they treat it with chemicals, extract the copper out of it. The rest they turned into slurry, piped into these lower areas. So that is the waste from the copper smelting process. Doesn't have anything to do with Tuzigoot, doesn't have to do anything with the ancient cultures. But the reason I want to talk about that is because from some of the literature I've read, the tailings are anywhere from 30 to 60 feet deep. So you have a lot of material down there. But what you probably had at one time, you had a natural depression where water naturally wants to go. Now what happened, back, probably 30,000 years ago, back in early times, the river used to flow right through here, does a loop, and then goes around this ridge, goes out this way through Tavaski Marsh, and then went out that way. But then through some subsidence, through some erosion, eventually the river got cut off, this loop got cut off, and then the river just continued to go that way. It goes around that way. But then again, as the ground continued to erode, as areas continued to subside, again the river was captured again. And now it follows its present course along that tree line and goes out that way towards Dead Horse Ranch State Park. So when it did that, first thing it did is isolated Peck's Lake. You have a natural oxbow lake, which is spring fed. It isolated that area there, and also isolated Tavaski Marsh. So it's created, some standing bodies of water. And then it also created this natural depression here where water naturally wants to go. Now during, thousands of years ago when we had these hunting and gathering cultures, you had an area which was probably very marshy. You had cattails down there, which are edible. You probably had beaver and otter. A lot of cottonwoods, which are water-loving trees, which could be used for building material. So definitely it was an ideal area, for some of their activities. Now eventually, agrarian cultures did move into this area. We think the Hohokam came in from the south about 200 AD or so. And with them, they brought the technology of irrigation. They dug a canal system all over the lowlands here. There's water from Peck's Lake beyond this flat kind of drops down here. Water from the marsh and possibly water from the river to irrigate their crops. Some of the main crops they grew was corn, squash, cotton, beans, and probably many other things, but we know they grew at least that because we have evidence of that. And now eventually, the Sinawa people showed up. I think they showed up around 900 AD or so. I think they came in from the north. And they intermingled with the Hohokam, and eventually the Sinawa people started to build houses on top of hills. And eventually got whole hilltop towns or pueblos. And archaeologists have discovered at least 50 large towns here in the Verde Valley. And it continued as an agricultural community. Now here you have this natural depression where water naturally wants to go. You have a canal system, which of course is gravity fed. Shut up, I'm talking here. But anyways, you have a canal system, which of course is gravity fed. You know, it definitely would have been an ideal location for growing crops such as cotton, such as corn, squash, you know, the various other different crops they were growing. We think they grew crops on both sides of the lowlands here. They probably used water from the marsh, water from the lake, water from the river to irrigate their crops. So of course they were adapting to, you know, to the landscape. They're adapting, you know, to the way the geology was changing. They're adapting to the resources which were available. Okay, if you'll follow me, we're going to go over on the east side. On the east side of Tuzigoot, we're going to talk about the construction of the east side of Tuzigoot.
Is the copper mine still in operation or closed down?
No, they shut down around 1950 or so. Okay, everybody. Okay, the reason I stop here is I want to talk about the construction of the east side and the south side of Tuzigoot. Now, eventually, you know, like I said, you know, we had agrarian cultures. They were growing crops. They were staying put. They were no longer moving around very much. They were building permanent structures made out of rock and mud. So they were adapting to the resources that they were producing, their produce. They were adapting to the resources which were available. And if you look inside here, you'll see these metates, these dark-colored rocks. What you'll see is you'll see a trough-shaped base with a handpiece. Now the base is called a metate, and the handpiece would be called a mano, a Spanish word meaning hand. And what it is a grinding stone used for grinding corn or large grains. And what you have is you have an improvement of the mortar and pestle design. What you have a trough-shaped base and a big squarish handpiece, so you can lean into it. So it makes it a lot easier for grinding corn, mesquite beans, other large grains. It just makes it easier. So people were adapting their technology to the resources that they were producing. Now, again, when the Sinawa people were here, again, there were both wet and dry periods. There were periods when they had plenty of rainfall. There were periods when there were, just very, very severe droughts. Now, sometimes archaeologists will wonder, they'll say, well, why did they build up on top of hills? You have all these towns, a lot of them are on top of hills. One theory is defense. The other theory is that when they first showed up here around 900 AD was the start of a wet period. So there's more water than usual. So possibly maybe those that were building down the lowlands were getting flooded out. Then even after the wet period ended, maybe they just kept up the tradition. And then again, there are periods when you had severe droughts, and people had to adapt to that. Now, around 1200 AD, that was pretty much like in the middle of a very severe drought. And during that time period, the drought became so severe that the people that were living up in the Flagstaff area, up in the Colorado Plateau, up above the Mogollon Rim, they were no longer able to maintain an agricultural lifestyle. And around that time, around 1200 AD, the entire Flagstaff area was completely abandoned. But on 1200 AD, more ruins were springing up here at Tuzigoot, here on the east side and over on the south side. And these ruins were being built even bigger. So what does that tell us?
Influx of people.
Influx, one, leaving the valley, people were coming here. And the reasons for that is that we had permanent standing bodies of water. We had Peck's Lake, we had the Vedra River, which is a perennial stream. If you go down to Montezuma's Well outside of Rimrock, we have Montezuma's Well, which produces a natural sinkhole, produces over 1.5 million gallons of water per day. So those were very attractive resources to the people that were living here. And then, at the same time, more rooms were being built bigger. So what does that tell us?
Intermingling and families were growing.
Intermingling, families were growing. So you might think to yourself, well, why do we have garages? Not to park cars, to store more junk. So it's possible that around that time period, they were actually more affluent here at Tuzigoot, or even in the Bed Valley. More rooms were being built, and they were being built bigger, so possibly they were having larger family sizes, possibly they were having more junk to store, maybe more pots of grain, things like that. So it shows that during times of drought, people were not leaving the Bed Valley, people were coming here. And apparently, during times when other cultures were having very hard times, apparently here at Tuzigoot they were very affluent. Apparently they were doing very well. Now, some of you gone in the museum, you probably noticed bones of macaws or parrots that are found here at Tuzigoot. Well, where's the closest place you can find parrots naturally? Mexico. So it shows they had trade connections at least as far south as Mexico, probably even farther than that. And then we also find jewelry made out of seashells. Well, where's the closest place you can find seashells naturally? The ocean. Some of these shells were traced all the way to the Gulf of California. So it shows they had trade connections as far west as the Pacific coast. And we don't even know how far these trade connections went. It could have been major trading centers that everybody converged on hundreds of miles around. Maybe they relayed the goods to the edge of territory back and forth that way. Or maybe people that settled little lives traversed these hundreds of miles and deal with all these cultures very different from their own. So when you think about it, during these times, these ancient cultures, they weren't isolated. They were trading among each other and communicating with each other. They were trading, collecting resources, and they were also learning new ideas and new methods. Now, does anybody have any other questions before we move on?
I do. Is this all that's remaining that left, or is this actually how it was? They had no cover?
Oh, well, at one time they did have roofs on it, yeah.
How much has this been reconstructed and how much is just natural?
That's actually a good question, and if you could, hang on to that question until we get into the center room, because then I'm going to talk more about the construction. Okay, let's go into the center room.
What is this down here?
All this bushy stuff?
No, it's not.
The room?
Taking shots of it?
No, not yet.
Huh?
I didn't yet. You can break off of this if you want to.
Why?
Do whatever you want to. It's only 12 o'clock, so.
Give me a good ahead of you.
Well, there was a desk up there. I know you. Sit down. Nope. You feel that? We'll go downhill a little bit.
Oh, look at all that, man.
I know, wow.
Where are you at?
You had Tuzigoot.
You want to go sit in front of the ground? Maybe there'll be some shade up here.
Okay, we're in here.
The stairs.
Here we go.
We're in here.
We're trying to get here.
Okay.
Oh,
Nice and cool here.
Sometimes people leave when you go around the corner over here.
Oh, this is the construction.
We're in here. We're coming. Okay.
There's the roof.
That's okay.
Hey, nice choice.
Uh-huh.
That's what we needed.
Use the wool for a moment.
Sit there. This is neat.
Problems not to damage the stone.
Is that everybody? Still more people coming?
Oh, I think we lost a few.
You lost the people? Okay. I hear
Oh, this is
footsteps. Not me. There's a couple. Here's a couple. We're in here.
Okay.
Any more people coming? Few. Few more
Am I
coming?
short enough not to block your view? Absolutely.
You staying down there? You coming up?
Yeah.
Is that everybody?
Yeah. All the stragglers are here.
Okay, question was asked. Okay, how much of Tuzigoot is original, how much is reconstruction? And actually, that's a very good question. Now, we really don't have a percentage on that. We really don't have a percentage on that. But in general, the lower parts are original, the upper parts are reconstruction. A generalization I heard from one of the Park Service archaeologists was that in general, the top 2 feet of most walls is reconstruction. But that's not entirely true for this entire monument. Some parts are more, some parts are less, depending on what part you're looking at. Now, I was also going to mention you might have saw some tools along the way. You might have saw some, maybe shovels and buckets and things like that. We do have an ongoing stabilization program called the Vanishing Treasures Program. It's nationwide throughout the National Park Service. Now what happens, we got a crew that comes out and they do a patchwork of modern mortar on top of the original stuff where it looks like it's deteriorating. So stabilization is an ongoing program here at Tuzigoot.
Are those volunteers or a mix?
No, there are permanent employees, but we also have seasonal employees that do that also, but they are paid. So in general, the lower parts of the walls are original, the upper parts are reconstructed, but even the lower parts are probably also covered with modern stabilization. Now, this room was one of the first rooms was constructed at Tuzigoot. We think this room was constructed around 1000 AD or so. Now, there could have been rooms earlier than that because we find rooms built on the rubble of other rooms. However, 1000 AD is the earliest datable rooms that we have. Now, this room in particular, we think at one time may have been a ceremonial room, and then maybe later on turned into living quarters. Reason we think that got this vent in the middle of nowhere, could have been an altar of some sort. And then there are some features about this room just kind of odd for living quarters. We think eventually was turned into living quarters, and then maybe the ceremonial room moved elsewhere on the site. Now this room is a good example of the Sinawa construction style. I always like to point it out on this wall because it's easier to see. When you look at this wall, you see this level here. Everything from this level down is original. This is what the Sinawa people built with their own hands, maybe about 1,000 years ago. Everything above that, including the roof and wooden beams, is reconstruction. This is what the archaeologists built, this is what the Park Service built. Now when the Sinawa people first started to build, they first used these fresh river cobbles, these dark granite rocks as you see here. Then apparently, for whatever reason, whether they ran out of that or whatever, they started to use this freshwater limestone, this white irregular rock you see here. And this did lead to some construction problems because this rock is so rough and irregular in shape that while the mortar is still wet, the rocks tend to shift one way or the other. In some of the later ones, we do find they used a technique we call chinking or spalling, where you get smaller rocks, embed that among large rocks. And that does lead to better stability because one, you have more rock per mortar, and then of course helps hold the rocks in place while the mortar is still wet. Now, in a large room like this, you got central beams made out of cottonwood and sycamore, rafters on top of that, a thatch made out of willow branches. On top of that, got matting of grass, top of that, 1 foot of mud. Let the mud dry up in the hot summer. Heat gets really hard pan, holds out water pretty good. And I've seen structures similar to this that are still in use, and they do hold out water pretty good. Just got to patch them up every now and then if they start to leak. Now, a lot of times people ask me, they'll say, Mr. Ranger, sir, they'll say, how high were the ceilings at Tuzigoot? Well, the average height of a man was 5 feet 6 inches. I'm 5 feet 7 without the hand. The average height of a woman was 5 feet 4, 5 feet even. Average height of a ceiling was about 6 feet or so. So it gives you a little bit of headroom, but not a lot. And probably the strategy for this was it was just more energy efficient for them to build that way.
Did they use only mud for mortar?
Generally, they used the plain mud as it was. They didn't put any straw in it or any binding material. They just used it straight. And that's very interesting, because when you look out here, you see all these grayish brown hills outside. What we have is what some people will loosely call a caliche-based mud. And what we mean by that is we have a mud or soil with a very high calcium base, a lot of calcium carbonate in that soil. One, it makes it very adhesive, and then when it dries very hard. I don't know if any of you have any experience with caliche. You're digging, and then clank, it feels like you hit cement. I mean, it's very hard. So apparently that was good enough for them. So they just used the mud straight. On a lot of the rooms, they would plaster the inside and the outside of the walls with a finer layer of clay. This kind of acts like a paint job, because when it rains, the rain hits the outside layer first, but the inner core of the wall remains protected. And then, of course, when it stops raining, well, then you gotta patch it up some more. So as you can see, it probably not only took a lot of work to build these walls, but we probably were patching them up all the time. It probably took a lot of work to maintain them. Now, a lot of times, anyways, what I was gonna say, you have the lower ceiling. It gets really cold out here during the winter. On an average winter night, it gets down to about 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Real cool winter night gets down to about 13 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, some of you might be from some of the more northern states, might not think it's very cold. Well, I don't care. It's cold. But let's say you build a nice large room with a nice high ceiling. You're going to bed down here for a night. You're going to be sleeping on mats and blankets and furs and things like that. Let's see, only source of heat, a small fire going in the middle. As a lot of us know, warm air or gases do tend to rise. So it'll probably take a heck of a long time before I actually warm up to get some shut-eye. However, you build a smaller room, lower ceiling, that's less volume for heat to bounce around it. So one of the rooms do heat up a lot faster. And also when you think about it, it's less valuable burnable material on the fire to keep it going all night. So definitely was more energy efficient for them to build that way. Now, a question I get a lot of people ask, Mr. Ranger will say, why did they come in through the ceiling? Why did they have hatchways through the roofs? Why didn't they come in through the side like normal people? Well, actually that's a very good question. At one time, this room would have been sealed all the way around. No windows or anything like that. That door would have not been there. The only way in and out would have been a hatchway through the roof. And you got ladders to go up and down. And there's two theories for that. One theory could have been, for defense. Some suggest that it was easier to defend either against animals or people if the opening is up on top. And then the other possibility could have been for the stabilization of temperatures. Now, it does get pretty warm out here during the summer. It'll get anywhere from 106 to 108 degrees during the day, but during the night it does cool down a lot. During the night it'll go down to about 60 or 70 degrees. A real warm night might go down to about 80 degrees. And what happens, like I said, cold air falls, cold air is denser, warm air rises. So during the night the cold air would fall into the room. And then during the day, because the cold air is heavier, the warm air, 108 degrees, stays outside. It does not penetrate into the mass of air that's inside the room. And it's kind of like, so what you have a room that's sealed all the way around. You have thick stone walls about 3 feet thick, and you got about a foot of mud up on top of that, or a foot of soil up on top of that. You come down, it's like coming down into a cave. It's just very, very cool. Some of you have cellars, have basements, or you crawl around under the house. You might notice it's always cooler down there than the rest of the house, and that's because the cold air falls into that lower space. So it's the same concept. It's like going in, and when you come down, it's like coming down into a cave. It's just very, very cool, very insulated. So people were adapting, to the conditions that were out here, the new desert conditions. Now, again, while they were here, there were wet periods and there were dry periods. During the wet periods, of course, there were plenty of cottonwoods down here, plenty of willows. People were using the cottonwoods and the willows, to build a roofing material, to build their houses. But then during times of drought, or even as the population was growing, the cottonwoods would diminish. You wouldn't have as many anymore. Definitely the willows would diminish, and people would have to go farther and farther out. Up on top of Mingus Mountain, it's about 7,000 feet up there. We do have ponderosa pine. So people may have gone farther up the mountain or farther out, and they would collect the new shoots of the ponderosas, and they would drag them down, and they would use that as building material to build their roofs, to build their housing. And then Again, the willows would be diminishing because we have times of drought, so then people would have to concentrate on the ocotillos and things like that. You would use ocotillo branches for the ribbing, things like that. So again, as the climate would change, would fluctuate from one way to the other, again the plant dominance shifts. And as the plant dominance shifts, people again have to learn, they have to adapt to the new resources which were available. Now, does anybody have any other questions before we move on?
What do they do about when it rains?
What do you do when it rains? Well, you can cover it with some kind of wooden covering or skin or something like that.
Oh,
Excuse me, go ahead.
they don't have smoke holes though.
Nope, that would have been it.
So that's it.
That's it.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
The poles you said were original construction, the peeled poles?
The poles were reconstruction. The poles are
Reconstruction.
reconstruction. So all the poles you see here, these are all reconstruction.
Mhm.
How many stories in this particular floor?
Archaeologists, we right now we have about 97 ground floor rooms here at Tuzigoot. Archaeologists believe that at one time there was 110 rooms altogether, including second and third story structures. Any other questions? These are all good questions. Okay, let's go to the top.
Would you like this as a bridal suit?
Let me know. Okay, is that everybody? Okay, I'm guessing everybody's here. Now the reason I come up here is I'd like to point out that the Sinawa people probably spend a lot of time on the roofs. This extra space could be used for a lot of different things. As you can see, you have a command view of the area. You can see people from miles around. Look down at the agriculture, see how the farm work is going. Look down at the canal system, see how the canal work is going. You can dry your foods up here. Because we get mild temperatures during the summer nights, you could even sleep up here. Pretty sure they did that. And then because of the insulation and mud, you couldn't even build a fire up here, cook your meals. We're pretty sure they did that also. Probably the inside was used more for storage and sleeping and things like that. So I think that the Sinawa people probably spent a lot of time outside, probably a lot of time on the roofs working. Now, archaeologists will call the period around 1300 AD the classic Tuzigoot phase. And many archaeologists believe that around that time period, the Sinawa people were pretty much at their economic peak. There were a lot of goods coming in, they're trading from all around, there are more rooms being built and being built bigger. So apparently they were doing very well at that time. But then, around the year 1400 or so, everybody in the Verde Valley kind of got up and left. And we're not exactly sure why. There are many theories why they could have gone, such as drought, warfare, disease, overuse of land, breakdown of trade routes. Many theories why they could have gone. However, none of these theories stands up very well under scrutiny. So it could have been any one of these things or maybe none of these things at all. Really need more evidence to determine exactly what was going on and exactly why they did leave. But we're pretty sure they did go to the north and join the Hopi and other Pueblo groups. We do have some physical evidence to support that, and also oral tradition among the Hopi themselves does kind of point that that's what happened. So eventually, the entire Verde Valley was abandoned. The people left this area around 1400. And as the people left, new cultures moved into the area. We have the Yavapai that came in from the south and the Apache that came in from the north. Now the Yavapai and the Apache were completely very different cultures with very different origins. The Yavapai, we would start from the Pai groups way down in Mexico, down in northern Mexico around Baja. They followed the Colorado River, coming up the Colorado River, and as these Pai groups came up, they dispersed, and as they dispersed, they diversified into the various different Pai cultures, including the Yavapai, the Wallapai, the Havasupai, some of those different groups. all speaking languages, different languages which originated from the human language root base. Now, at the same time, we had the Apache coming in from the north, or we had the Athapascan roots, or the Athapascan groups coming in from the north, coming down south. And again, they were diversifying, they were dispersing and diversifying into the Navajo and the various Apache cultures. And then when it came down into the Verde Valley, apparently there was enough resources for everybody. They were both hunting and gathering cultures and that moved around a lot. And apparently there was enough resource for everybody. And as far as we can tell, they lived as peaceful neighbors, for many, many, many hundreds of years. Now, eventually, as a lot of us know the way history goes, eventually we got European Americans or European settlers, coming into this area from the east and from the south. We had the Spanish moving in here. We had the Mexican cultures. We had the English Americans coming in from the east. And eventually, as a lot of us know the way history went, eventually the indigenous cultures were removed, and we saw the Dust Bowl back in the 30s. We saw the depletion of devastation of the eastern forest. We saw environmental pollution, and we also saw the environmental movement of the 60s. And what we see is we see a pattern here. We see a pattern which is common all through history, all over the world. And what we find is that the geology and the availability of water not only determine what resource will be available, but also where and what quantities. And for that reason, the Verde River is of paramount importance in not only establishing the soil, the plants and animal communities, but even the human communities that came afterwards. And as you can see, no civilization lives forever. All rise and fall, just like the Hohokam of the Southwest or the Mayans of ancient Mexico. And when these civilizations fall, eventually people will disperse into the surrounding countryside to live a simpler lifestyle, more of a hunting and gathering existence. And eventually another civilization will arrive or rise, and that civilization will rise, and eventually that civilization will fall. And again, people would disperse into the surrounding countryside. So when you think about it, the cycle will begin anew. And it doesn't matter what politicians tell you. The health of all economies are directly dependent on the health of the natural resource base. And if we don't manage our resources wisely, well, we may seal our own fate. And archaeologists of the future will be wondering, well, who are these people? Why did they leave? So thank you very much. I'm glad you all guys showed up, and I thank you all for coming. I wish you a happy stay here at Tuzigoot. I invite you to take advantage of all the service sites here in the Verde Valley. There's Montezuma's Castle, Montezuma's Well, outside towns of Camp Verde and Rimrock, other ancient Sinaloa sites which are also interesting. Or go north of here, go into Red Rock country, you'll find miles and miles of beautiful hiking territory. Just remember, take plenty of water and plenty of munchies. Also be aware if there's any sign of rain or moisture, those dirt roads can get really slick, you get stuck out there. So make sure you got a 4-wheel drive and a horse tied to the back of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome, it's my pleasure. If you have any questions, being in the museum, could ask us anything you want. We know the answers, we tell you. If not, we can tell you where you can look them up.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
How far is
Your
this
hat of
Jerome?
Panama?
Jerome, you have to go up the hill 7 miles.
It's gotta go back towards Clarksdale or something.
Clarkdale, right over there where you see the white building, that's the St. Church. That's the main road. To the left up the hill. Follow the signs 8982 Jerome and Prescott.
Okay, Jerome, that's one up in the hill there?
Jerome is up on the hill, yeah.
Sure.
Oh, they do. We charge $2 a piece, but in this takes care of you, your spouse, your children, your parents.
Well, how do I get one of those of my own?
You prove that you are 62. I'm a citizen or a resident, and you buy it for $10. But as long as you travel with this person, you don't need to. Yeah.
So would that be an advantage to my children time when I got one now?
Or you always got.
We'll see how old these are.
Well, yeah, because you buy it in National Park.